Thank you, Cassidy, and there'll be an opportunity, obviously, to pick up any particular points or questions that you'd like to direct to Cassidy in the question and comments session after the speakers. I'd now like to invite Sara Pantuliano from ODI's Humanitarian Policy Group to give us perhaps a perspective from some of the work and research that you've been doing here, and particularly with that lens on from the humanitarian context, which is really what we want to drill down on as we look at the challenges that the report raises.
Thanks, David. I've had the privilege of having access to the report before everybody else, so I've actually gone through it to see whether there were elements in the report that resonated with the findings of the research we have been doing so far. And it's remarkable the extent to which, even though the report focuses on post-disasters risk and our research focuses on urbanization in post-conflict environments primarily, actually the issues highlighted are the same, and I'll reflect on that. We have started about a year and a half ago, a large project looking at particularly urban displacement, but I would say really urbanization in relation to displacement, looking though at displacement-affected communities in their entirety, so IDPs, refugees, and those who receive these communities. And we're doing the study in 9 different countries. We have finished 5 case studies in Sudan, and I'll focus on that because obviously we have the findings of these. We have done a preliminary case study in Kenya, in Nairobi, and we have ongoing follow-up work in Kenya. We have an ongoing study in Afghanistan, one starting in Syria, and next year we're doing work in Jordan, the Gaza Strip, Yemen, Somalia, and there's one missing, will come. Is a 9th case study that we're doing. But a large body of work really looking at a variety of different settings to try and tease out why we think it is important for humanitarian organizations to consider the challenges that living in cities present to vulnerable populations. There are a number of issues in the report that I'd like to reflect upon. The first of these is the challenge in urban context for urban poor and vulnerable populations at large of having access to decent housing. Cassidy has gone through it, has shown how strongly vulnerability and risk are related to the issue of housing, and that has emerged very clearly from our work as well. Much of the problem is that in these environments, the risk posed by populations of living in informal settlements that are poorly serviced and poorly planned is that governments largely ignore these settlements, or at best, they bulldoze people by moving them somewhere else where they're actually removed from their livelihoods. This came out very strongly from our work both in Khartoum and in Juba, but also in Port Sudan. A lot of the very large caseloads of both IDPs in Khartoum and returnees in Juba have congregated in informal settlements that, even though were poorly planned, they provided them with a link to livelihoods. They were close to markets, or they were close to land that they could farm, or they were close to the river where they could make bricks. And the response from the government has always been not to understand how housing was so intrinsically linked to livelihoods, and offer what they felt were better alternatives by moving them to better planned settlements. And definitely some of the settlements to which IDPs have been relocated in Khartoum are better serviced, are better planned, but they're very far away. They're like 2 hours bus ride, which is very expensive and unaffordable for people at best, and removes them completely from access to the primary livelihoods activities. So what happens is that these settlements are planned, people are moved away, but they crawl back, little by little, because they can't survive out there. They have no access to any form of generating income. Now, this often happens also in the reconstruction efforts that many humanitarian organizations are involved in, and some of this is reflected in the report, how we often try to build back better and build houses which are safer or sort of better service, but we rebuild them somewhere else where it's actually not very good for people to be, where people don't want to be. So the people will try always, to go back to the old settlements and recreate the problem. And until we learn to actually support people to upgrade, the places in which we live, focus on the strategies that many of them have adopted in the first place, to select the location and live there. Think of, solutions that can help them improve, their safety, their security, their access to land titles, which is a big issue, and I'll reflect on that in a moment. People will remain vulnerable. Now, a lot of the reconstruction efforts, generally post-disasters, but also in the post-conflict environment, ignore issues around tenure, how to support people to acquire a more durable title on the land that they're occupying. And that's because, out of the costs involved with it or the legal implications, and because many of the organizations involved find that too difficult, too complicated, too cumbersome to try and help communities to actually acquire a stronger and more durable title over the land they've occupied. But that's something that actually can be done, and there are things that in a number of different contexts, organizations like the Norwegian Refugee Council, for instance, has been doing about providing legal aid to people to be able to retain the land they've occupied, informally for a long time, for instance. A lot of the problem is also because following disasters and following conflict, land on which people have informally lived for many years is actually very often grabbed or seized illegally very quickly, and that can be done either through violent action, but also through very carefully planned legislative reform. I mean, we've seen that post-tsunami, how much of the very valuable land that was by the coast was actually made available to investors in a number of rather devious ways. But also, what we're seeing in Juba at the moment, but also in Khartoum, is changing the classification of the land so that the poor can actually aspire to retain a title on that, because they are forced to build to certain specifications very rapidly, and they clearly don't have the income to be able to build a two-story house within 2 years. It's impossible for them. So, but you can exclude somebody very rapidly by creating a de facto situation of this type. The other area that the report reflects upon that resonates very closely with our finding is the increased risk to health that living in urban environments poses. Now, there is almost an assumption that if you're in town, you're better off because you have more access to services. Our research shows that that's quite the contrary. Actually, health risk can increase significantly in town. One thing that came out quite clearly from the research in Port Sudan was increased levels of malnutrition and TB in some of the urban areas. Now, I think what all the studies have shown is that the common trend is that obviously people live in rather unhealthy conditions, so often near a dump or on a dump, often in areas where there is very poor waste management, in almost all cases where water is untreated. In Juba, people commonly use the water for the Nile for drinking or for all purposes, and that has generated a number of outbreaks of cholera. Creates almost chronic diarrhea problems and so forth. The proximity in which people live in the slums increases the risk of infectious disease, of deadly airborne diseases like TB and pneumonia and so forth. And what we also found is the very high level of increased levels compared to rural areas of HIV/AIDS. That's particularly as a result of greater promiscuity and increased levels of prostitution. I'll say something about this in a minute. But something that is also often ignored by international organizations, which is actually very powerful, has been to hear of really high level of depression, of unipolar depression, particularly in areas where IDPs have felt very isolated from the rest of their context, where they've lived for many years with hosting communities with which they've struggled to integrate, and where at best they've really had to make enormous, go through enormous changes to assimilate. I mean, for instance, in Khartoum, what we've seen with the southern IDPs has been increased level of, using bleaching creams, to try and make their skin fairer, or adopting strategies like infibulation that was, completely alien to their culture to fit in. And that's because in the urban context, the traditional, social network and support system fails in some cases to recreate, or if it is recreated, clashes with some of the networks of the host communities. This this leads me to some areas that were not reflected in your report, but that have come out strongly from our research in terms of the challenges that the urban context poses, particularly to youth. There are a large group of young people that move to towns with the hope of finding better, easier access to jobs, better opportunities, better services, and become very often quite demoralized, depressed in some cases, but in many cases reacting by getting together, getting organized around gangs. And that in Juba and in Khartoum, actually, we've seen how the arrival of increasing level of young returnees, from after the end of the war in 2005, but also the young IDPs from Darfur in Khartoum, has actually progressively also led to an increase in gang culture, and gangs that operate almost as really well organized criminal organizations. I mean, it's a very clear economic strategy to try and make money that allows them to survive. The other obvious strategy for many, particularly women, has been prostitution, and the levels of prostitution, not just at the really the poorest end of the new arrivals in town, but also university students who have basically increasingly resorted to prostitution in a place like Khartoum to be able to afford fees, because again they've moved to towns hoping that they could get to university, improve their level of education, have been unable to find ways of sustaining their stay in town, and all of this happens in a context where their social safety nets don't exist anymore, and they really struggle to to find sort of alternatives that are less distressing. I want to end by highlighting some of the positive of moving to the towns, because of course people move because there are opportunities and there are clear sort of elements that would allow us as international organizations to be leveraged to help people that move to towns to make better use of the livelihoods opportunities that do exist. Last year we did research in Nairobi on the refugees, and it was very powerful the extent to which the Somali communities had been able to make huge profit of the opportunity of being in Nairobi. The extent to which they've gone means that they control the business in many areas of Nairobi. They actually employ Kenyans. They have been able to make use of the opportunities that living in town presents. There are other advantages for many IDPs and refugees. Being in town means being able to hide. People who feel persecuted or are running away because of clear threats in the urban environment, they find a protective space that is not available in their home communities. Now the problem is, why are, as humanitarian organizations, are we not better able to capitalize on the opportunities that present to us to support these communities? What came out of our research very clearly so far, and it would be interesting to see what happens in the other case studies we are doing, is that there is this false assumption amongst many humanitarian organizations that because you're in town, you're okay. And we've been told that. Pretty much in every city we've done work so far. Whenever we have talked with humanitarian organizations stationed in Khartoum, in Yala, in Nairobi, but operating in the rural areas, we've been actually, what we've heard has been, well, if you've made it to Khartoum, if you've made it to Juba, then you're okay. Failing to understand that many of the levels of vulnerability, morbidity, rates, mortality are actually very similar in some of the slums as they are in many of the rural areas in which we operate. There are areas in which we have strong competencies, both in terms of service provision, but protection, interventions that clearly warrant our assistance, but we are not good enough as a community at recognizing, that there is a role for us to play. And it could be because of, obviously stronger government presence in the cities and the difficulty that the humanitarian community traditionally has to be working closely with government. I don't know, it'd be interesting to have more discussion about this later on. The only exception being, and I end here, really some work has started to be kind of replicated more and more in the area of legal aid, but very few organizations, particularly the NRC, and work by medical organizations in terms of service provisions, and in these organizations like MSF and others are at the forefront. The ones that are operating in these environments very strongly are the local organizations. A lot of the local partners that we traditionally work with have started to have strong presence in terms of offering legal aid to their communities, and we've seen that in Khartoum. This space is only filled by local organizations. Where we are absent, they play a very strong role, and I think it's incumbent on us to reflect on how we can better support these national efforts.
Okay. Thank you.